Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 362. And this is a special episode. It's number 6 in my series of label guides, and it's a biggie, Prestige Records. As always, my goal here is to provide some assistance to people who are just getting into vinyl record collecting and jazz and want to figure out, well, why do labels matter? Well, of course, as we know, they do matter. They matter because of the way the label influences the artist. They matter because of the way the label influences the music, which is actually recorded. And they also matter because of the way the label can influence the sound of the music. In doing research for this video, of course, I've relied on my own collection and my experience of it, but also on a number of other resources. I'd like to particularly acknowledge Professor Michael Jarrett of Penn State University, who conducted an exhaustive interview of Bob Weinstock, the owner of Prestige Records, in 1995. A lot of that has been committed to a book of his. I happen to have a copy here, pressed for all time, which I recommend highly. It's got all kinds of tidbits about the production of different classic jazz records. I'd also like to acknowledge, of course, the great work, the exhaustive work done by a London Jazz Collector in looking at the finer details, the physical details of labels and pressings in the classic era of jazz. I've relied here and there on material from interviews and blogs compiled by Stephen Serra of Jazz Profiles and Mark Myers of Jazz Wax. Actually, Mark Myers also has a great book, Why Jazz Happened, which I'll plug here. Anyway, he is an absolute font of knowledge. And whatever the label we're talking about, it's always great to be able to rely on the fine detail compiled on the people and the music and the recording studios of particular jazz recordings put together exhaustively by the friendly obsessives at the Jazz Discography Project. And links to all those resources are in the description below. The story of Prestige Records is basically the story of Bob Weinstock, who between 1949 and 1972 produces something like 1,000 jazz recordings at the label he founded. Prestige and its sub-imprints like New Jazz and Moodsville and so on include many of the greatest records in jazz history. In the greatest years of modern jazz, Prestige produced more records than Blue Note by the same artists or artists of a similar caliber and using the same recording engineer for the most part. And it's fairly uncontroversial to say that no jazz collection is complete without a fair number of Prestige releases on the shelf. That's just a fact. And yet, Prestige under Bob Weinstock is not always universally praised for a few reasons. For some, Prestige is a budget version echo of Blue Note, recording New York jazz stars at a fair clip in these impromptu blowing sessions without any rehearsal. On the flip side of that, Weinstock would often argue that it was the very spontaneity of his recording sessions that captured the essence of jazz, which you couldn't really capture if you rehearsed endlessly. One can also argue that Prestige took fewer risks for the sake of art. Weinstock's instincts were always more conservative than, for instance, Alfred Lion at Blue Note or Bob Thiel at Impulse, and for such a big and prolific label, the Prestige catalog barely touches the avant-garde music of the era. But setting those points aside, perhaps the most significant and serious critique of Prestige is the charge that it actively exploited its roster of artists, particularly in the 1950s. And this point is made because a huge percentage of those that Prestige recorded were heroin addicts who, due to the nature of their illness, were often flat broke and pretty desperate and in a vulnerable position. To these folks, Weinstock paid less than the other independents, certainly less than Blue Note, and he would often sign people to multi-record deals with very small cash advances. The charge is basically that Weinstock was exploiting those who were using, he was paying a pittance to a lot of black artists and hurrying them through these recording sessions because he could. Again, there's a counterpoint to this because Weinstock would often argue, long and hard, that he would take chances on people that the major labels wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, and he was giving them opportunity they wouldn't otherwise get. And to be fair, this point is often made by some of these very artists themselves. So Prestige is not without controversy, and we'll dip into a bit of that, but what's uncontroversial is the quality of the music that was made. Bob Weinstock was born in New York in October 1928. He grew up on the Upper West Side. He was basically a lifelong jazz fan. His dad was a jazz fan. He was a shoe salesman, but he would take his son to go and buy used records, used 78s from the golden age of jazz in the 20s and 30s. And when Bob starts to come to real musical consciousness around 1940, he's really into Louis Armstrong's Hot Fives and Hot Sevens and King Oliver, giants of pre-war jazz. He becomes what we would call these days an expert crate digger, buying rare records at bargain prices from junk stores. And in the fall of 1944, at age just 15, he starts his own mail order business, reselling these used records, kind of a proto-Discogs retailer. Here's the first appearance of his name in print a few months later in February 1945 in an ad in the Record Changer, which of course was run by Orrin Keepnews and Bill Grauer, who would later found Riverside Records. Pretty soon he's doing a roaring trade, and by age 18, just a couple years later, he's ready to start his own bricks and mortar record store, which he does by leasing some space from an existing store, the Jazz Record Center at 47th and 6th Avenue, which was run by a retired boxer and circus strongman, Big Joe Klauberg. Weinstock had planned to sell old records at this store, but Klauberg already had that market tied up, so he switches to selling new material. And as a retailer of new records in New York, he begins to develop relationships not just with the big distributors who handled the giants like RCA and Columbia and Decca, but with the smaller independent labels like Blue Note, which is how he first meets Alfred Lion. Lion, Blue Note's co-founder and main producer, was impressed by Weinstock's ability to shift all manner of the stock that Blue Note was sending him, particularly the more traditional stuff like Sidney Bechet. One day he drops by the store to give the kid a present of a Thelonious Monk record. Now, Weinstock at that point was not in any way a fan of bebop or of the new sounds, but he figured if Lion, whom he idolized, was into Monk, then maybe he should be too. So he quickly set about immersing himself in the scene, and he became a regular at, amongst other places, the Royal Roost, which was one of the places where bebop was percolating. And there he met many of the soon-to-be giants of modern jazz. This includes Kenny Clarke, who not only introduces Weinstock to Thelonious Monk, but a whole bunch of other folks as well. And given all this, it's not hard to see how Weinstock becomes a bebop aficionado in just a short period of time. He embraced this new music, and given his endless nightclubbing, he was able to befriend many of its brightest stars. He was this big, brash Jewish kid in a nocturnal world of black jazz stars, but they could tell how much he loved the music and how much he understood it. With all these connections, the next step, from selling records to actually making them, was just around the corner. Kenny Clarke had said that if Weinstock started a jazz label, he would get all the big names to record for him, but that was easier said than done. In early 1949, Weinstock does start a label, and he calls it New Jazz. What he really wanted to do was record people like Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, but unsurprisingly, they were already tied up, otherwise engaged. So Weinstock, and not for the last time, reaches out to a second tier of artists who were up-and-comers but couldn't get a record deal and to whom he had something to offer. He first approaches the alto player Lee Konitz, who does want to record with Weinstock, but suggests that the record might be better and do better if they brought in Lenny Tristano as a leader, who was a bigger name. And so in January 1949, Konitz and Tristano ended up making 8 sides for New Jazz. They were originally released as singles on 10-inch 78s, and then in 1951 as a 10-inch LP with all 8 sides. This is actually a reissue. You can see that it still has the New Jazz LP catalog number, but by the end of the year, Weinstock had renamed the label Prestige, and so the new logo is there. But this is the original, very first number 101 release of Prestige. It was well reviewed, and it sold well. And on the basis of that, Weinstock goes on to sign some more saxophonists. He signs Stan Getz, he signs Jerry Mulligan, he signs Alan Eager. And the records which Getz made following this in 1949 and 1950 basically put Weinstock on the map. This is one of the early ones. This was before they had really figured out how to make an attractive cover. Eventually they started adding pictures. But the significance of the logo is that Weinstock was having a lot of success with sax players, and hence the saxophone, which had been his vehicle so far. By the end of 49, Prestige had taken over as the imprimatur of the label, and New Jazz, for a while anyway, was cast aside. In the early years, Weinstock used a variety of studios in New York. These included Nola's Penthouse on 57th, near the park, and Belltone Studios, which was a little closer to Times Square. And while the records that he made there, and here are some more, this is Jerry Mulligan and Alan Eager, whom I mentioned. Here's another record with Konitz and Getz. This is, what are we at, the 8th release here. Again, the new sounds. While these records from 1950 to 1953 are of great musical interest and of great historical interest, the sound that Weinstock was getting was nothing like what will be true a few years later. These are okay. They're kind of low fidelity. They have that, what I might term, wartime kind of sound. Some of the instruments seem almost ignored by the microphone. The piano will sound like it's in the back of the hall. That was a problem, but it wasn't going to be solved immediately. And what did need to be solved immediately was developing a bigger network and getting out there and distributing records, but also finding new talent. Weinstock works really hard. He was a fearful flyer, so he gets on the Greyhound bus and he travels all over the United States, 1950, 51, 52, talking to radio stations, talking to DJs, talking to promoters, and also keeping his ear to the ground for new talent. And that's how he ends up recording people like Hampton Hawes and Wardell Gray out in LA. So here's a record. This is the Memorial album, which is really quite a good record, but it's recorded out in LA in 49, 50, and 51 by Weinstock on his tour. Back in New York, he kept up influential relationships with people like the DJ Symphony Sid, who had a national profile. He also had to deal with some mobbed up competition, in particular the guys at Savoy Records, with whom he had a literal get in a car moment. Luckily for him, he had his own mob connections and survived that one. And in the process of all this, almost by happenstance, Weinstock ends up documenting the two major streams of new jazz in the early 1950s. Cool jazz, as in the music of Mulligan, Konitz, and Getz, but also bop like J.J. Johnson. By 1953 or so, it was all still kind of hand to mouth, and he was saved on at least one occasion from going under by a hit record here or there. The most notable of those was a single by a singer called King Pleasure, who had done a remake of something by James Moody called Moody's Mood for Love. It was not necessarily great art, but in 1954, jukebox owners could not get enough of it. And this early pattern remains characteristic of Prestige throughout most of its existence, where you have truly great contemporary jazz selling moderately, people like Getz or Zoot Sims or Wardell Gray, being kept afloat by sales of more popular material by artists who might be great musicians, but who were performing more familiar, more accessible music. James Moody was one of those, as is Gene Ammons, who recorded for Prestige more than any other musician in history. This is, I think, a first pressing, actually, of his great record, Boss Tenor. There are a lot of Gene Ammons records, I think something like 39 for the label. Anyway, not knocking Ammons. He made dozens of records for Prestige and basically kept the label afloat at key points. And there are some great ones in there, but just like Jimmy Smith at Blue Note, it's hard to make a case for collecting them all. But that's okay. Despite putting out a lot of commercial stuff, by the mid-1950s, Weinstock was also arguably recording the greatest artists of the era. Miles, Coltrane, Rollins, Monk, and he was recording them beautifully as well. From the very beginning, Bob Weinstock was signing great musicians to Prestige. He picked up Thelonious Monk early on after Monk had kind of fallen on his face a bit at Blue Note, not really selling any records despite having huge backing from the label owner. He'd also had his cabaret card taken away due to a drug case in which he was only peripherally involved. Here is a great Monk LP from those days. Still didn't sell, but great music. He also picked up Miles Davis around this time. Miles was signed in 1951 on a relatively short-term deal after Weinstock had heard some of the great music that he'd done with Gil Evans and Mulligan in that whole Birth of the Cool Nonette. Miles would go on to make some of the greatest music of his whole career, in fact, some of the greatest music in the jazz canon in the years 1951 to 1956 when he was signed to Prestige, although this period also includes some of the most difficult years of Miles's life, largely due to his heroin addiction. And I would argue that the greatest period for Prestige begins with two kind of unrelated events. One of those is Miles getting clean in the winter of 1953-1954, which ushers in a whole new era of landmark jazz recordings by Miles and others. The second, which occurs around the same time, is Bob Weinstock meeting and beginning to work with the recording engineer Rudy Van Gelder. Van Gelder, who was originally an optometrist, had been making great music for Blue Note since the beginning of 1953. Weinstock, as I mentioned before, was a great admirer of Blue Note, and he decided that he was going to go and visit Van Gelder's optometry clinic in the following December just to have a conversation. And Van Gelder let it be known at the time that no, he wasn't under any kind of exclusive deal with Blue Note, and if Weinstock wanted to start showing up with musicians, Van Gelder would be perfectly happy to record them. Van Gelder had famously set up a studio in the living room of his parents' house on Prospect Avenue in Hackensack, New Jersey, and every Friday, beginning in January 1954, Weinstock would show up with a bunch of jazz musicians to make a record. And by the late 1950s, he was making up to 75 LPs a year in Hackensack, and the sound was incredible. It was three-dimensional. You could hear all the different instruments for starters. And here are a couple of records just to demonstrate. So this is a nice little record from 1952, recorded in December 1952, I think at Nola's Penthouse, the Billy Taylor Trio. It's got some great tracks on here. In particular, They Can't Take That Away From Me, such a great standard, but just doesn't sound very good, I have to say. And now contrast that with this record, which is kind of the MJQ modern jazz quartet with Horace Silver added on piano. And by the way, incidentally, you can tell it's a Van Gelder recording. This was I think the 10th session that Prestige did at Van Gelder's studio. You can tell that it's a Van Gelder recording because of the telltale sign of the Venetian blinds in the corner of the picture there, because of course the living room at Prospect Avenue had Venetian blinds. Anyway, this record which incidentally also has, oh, look at it, it's falling apart. It also has the fireworks label on it, a maroon version of the fireworks label. Has all the hallmarks of a Van Gelder recording. Crisp horns, slightly dodgy piano, but still way better than had ever been recorded, and a sense of where all the instruments are and what they sounded like. Just mentioned for label nerds, while the adoption of the fireworks label happens shortly after Van Gelder and Weinstock start working together, the yellow label did not appear for some time yet. This is something made at the end of 1954. This is this record, Kai and JJ. There you can see the Venetian blinds as well, and you'll see that it has a yellow fireworks label. And in fact, I learned during the making of this video that this is actually the very first yellow fireworks label release. So let the nerd alarm ring out. One other thing to notice on this is the, if I can just show it in the light, there it is the Plastilite P, or the little ear-shaped etching just at the top of the dead wax there, which is basically a demonstration that not only was Weinstock now using Blue Note's preferred recording engineer, he was also using Blue Note's preferred pressing plant at this time as well. Despite that level of mimicry or flattery or whatever you want to call it, there were other ways in which Weinstock was not at all like Alfred Lion. Alfred Lion was a known perfectionist. He would pay for rehearsals. He would get very involved with Rudy Van Gelder and how the whole recording setup was conducted and executed. He would regularly ask for playbacks. They would do multiple takes and so on. Weinstock wanted no part of that. He'd show up on a Friday with the musicians that he'd managed to collect. They would roll tape and play whatever the musicians wanted to play. There would be no rehearsal. He rarely asked, according to Van Gelder, for a playback. And if he didn't like a take, he wouldn't keep the outtake. He would just ask for the tape to be rolled back and record all over it again. In fact, the only artist known to actually be able to successfully push back on Weinstock's lack of rehearsal was the Modern Jazz Quartet when they made their record Django, which, if you know anything about the MJQ, kind of makes sense. So Weinstock was deliberately unfussy. He considered Van Gelder a genius, and he didn't feel it was his place to try and control how Van Gelder or these giants of modern jazz went about their business. Soon after hooking up with Van Gelder, Weinstock also secures Miles Davis on a multi-record deal. Now, of course, he'd signed Miles earlier, but Miles had been in a highly erratic place, doing a lot of junk. He had been pimping. He was in a lot of terrible relationships in his personal life of all kinds. He'd gone out of town to get clean in the winter of 53, 54, and he'd come back ready to make records. There was an added bonus to this deal with Davis because Davis then brought John Coltrane in to his quintet, and Coltrane, of course, goes on to record as a leader for Prestige as well. Other mid-1950s additions to the Prestige roster include Sonny Rollins, Jackie McLean, Phil Woods, Elmo Hope, George Wellington, Red Garland, Kenny Burrell, Donald Byrd, on and on and on it goes. And for 7 years, from 1954 to 1961, this Friday Club made hundreds of amazing records, and that included 6 records which are amongst Davis's best. And here they are. This, of course, is Walkin'. This is from 1954. Some would say this is the record which really blows the whistle or kicks off the ball or what have you for hard bop in the mid-1950s. Then there is the record famously made on Christmas Eve 1954 with Miles and Thelonious Monk, actually a couple sessions, but the more famous session is the Christmas Eve session. Bag's Groove, just a fantastic record. And of course, those 4 records that Miles had to make in a hurry in 1956 after he'd signed for Columbia without telling Weinstock. And Weinstock, upon learning what was going on, said, well, you can go as soon as you make those 4 records that you owe me. And in 2 different dates, one in the spring and one in the fall of 1956, Miles comes up with 4 LPs that are amongst the classics of the genre. Here are a couple of them. These were released in dribs and drabs by Prestige, not all at once. Workin' and Relaxin'. Oh, wait, I have another one here. And, oh, I have all 4. How about that? Steamin', and my favorite cover of the lot, Cookin'. This string of great records also includes music from Sonny Rollins, which people would say are definitely his best with any label. They include Sonny Rollins Plus 4. They include a couple that I have right here. The absolutely wonderful Saxophone Colossus, that's just a great record. And Tenor Madness, which famously includes his pseudo duel with John Coltrane. It includes Jackie McLean's debut for the label called Lights Out. I have a very terrible, probably the worst possible issue of this you can get. Terrible cover. The original cover is much better. And on top of this, it's electronically reprocessed for stereo, which really nothing should be electronically reprocessed, not your food and certainly not your 1950s prestige jazz. But it is a great record nonetheless. It includes, of course, a number of records by Coltrane himself, including his excellent debut with the great cover photo taken by Esmond Edwards, the actual producer of this record, incidentally. More on that later. And then some records which came out later on, like Lush Life and Stardust. Weinstock was big on holding on to unreleased material and then dribbling it out years later when the quality of product that he had on hand wasn't as good as it was in the late 1950s. Coltrane also wasn't as famous in the early years with Prestige as he would be later on. Here's a good example of this. This was previously co-billed as a John Coltrane and Red Garland record. Later, it is reissued as, I think this is a 70s reissue, as Training In with Coltrane, obviously the focus. And here's another record, which I think got reissued under Coltrane's name fully, but this is a collaboration record between two tenors, John Coltrane and Paul Quinichette. There's all kinds of records we could mention in this great period for Prestige. A couple others I would like to mention are by Miles Davis's great piano player in his first great quintet, and obviously a bandmate of John Coltrane's, Red Garland. Here's a couple. This is Groovy, which is a trio setting with Paul Chambers and Art Taylor. I mean, that really is an absolutely phenomenal lineup. It's a great record. And one of my real favorites, All Morning Long, or All Morning Long, I should say, which also has John Coltrane and Donald Byrd, so you really can't complain about the lineup there. So that's a level at which Prestige was punching in the late 1950s. I would say for a stretch of time, every bit the equal of what Blue Note was putting out. As much as Prestige did really well in the 1950s in recruiting top-level talent, Weinstock ended up having a hard time holding on to a lot of folks. And Prestige eventually became known informally as kind of a farm team for the bigger labels. Why was this? Well, Prestige didn't have some of the inbuilt advantages that places like Columbia had. For instance, they had no rock and roll acts. They were ill-equipped to compete with labels that did and which were benefiting from the booming teenage culture in America in the post-war years. But perhaps more importantly, Weinstock just didn't pay much. Whatever the truth about exploiting drug users, getting records from Coltrane for $300 a crack is kind of a steal. And he also had a habit of getting musicians to sign over their publishing rights as well. Again, sometimes in exploitative circumstances, but who knows how common that was. One of the greatest records in jazz history, which I just mentioned a bit before, Miles Davis's Bag's Groove, is made on December 24th, 1954, or most of it is, certainly the bits with Davis and Monk playing together. And the reason it's made is because Monk and Davis both phone up Weinstock, who's their label guy, and say they're broke and it's Christmas and they've got no money and can't they make a record to get some cash for Christmas? Like literally, it was that hand to mouth. This is how his artists, and these are the greatest artists in jazz history, this is how they're being treated by their label. So as the 1950s wore on, Weinstock sees his biggest talent lured away by better deals. Miles goes to Columbia, as I mentioned. Coltrane goes first to Atlantic. Rollins leaves the label and records for a whole bunch of folks before he ends up with RCA. And it wasn't just that Weinstock was getting outbid by much richer labels, which of course he was. It was also about the fact, or the allegation, that he was ripping off his artists by paying them far too little and taking advantage. Jackie McLean, when he left in 1961, makes a big deal about this. So what should we make of this? Was Weinstock a rip-off artist? Well, he certainly wasn't beneath making some kind of shocking offers to artists at particular points when he felt that he could. Famously, he once offered Mingus and Mingus's trio $10, free lunch, free coffee, and some cocaine to make a record. Unsurprisingly, he never got the opportunity to record with Mingus again. Weinstock was full of resentment about these other labels and their practices. He's got terrible things to say about Nasui Erdogan and about Bob Thiel and other folks. But by the same token, he never, ever even remotely tried to treat artists as well as even Blue Note or Impulse were treating them, let alone the big marquee blue ribbon labels. He might not have been as exploitative as the Chess Brothers were towards blues artists on their label, or Herman Lubinsky was for Savoy Records, but he wasn't great. Miles Davis's attitude towards Weinstock probably sums it up the best. On the one hand, Davis is on record in his autobiography as saying, Weinstock took me on in the early 50s when basically nobody else would give me a chance because of the way I was conducting myself and my habit. Fair enough. But he also makes it very clear that Weinstock never paid what he was worth. He never paid him much money and often seemed to treat black musicians like they were there to be exploited. But whatever we think of Weinstock and whatever the reasons for these departures, I would argue that the end of Prestige's period of true greatness as a label comes in 1961, when after all the other departures, Jackie McLean leaves for Blue Note and Eric Dolphy leaves to record with a whole bunch of other folks. Now, just a caveat on that statement. If you consider the hard bop product of Prestige to be its greatest product, then yes, 1961 is kind of the end of the era. If you're a big soul jazz fan, by contrast, feel free to disagree because some of the best soul jazz that was ever made was to come for Prestige in the 1960s. By 1961, Prestige as an innovative force in contemporary jazz was largely spent. Of course, there are later exceptions like Jackie Bayard, Booker Ervin, a few others, but by late 1961, the modern jazz quartet was long gone, Miles was long gone, Rollins was long gone, Coltrane was gone, Dolphy and McLean had just left. Prestige still had some innovators here and there, but what you get in the 1960s is much more the commercial, radio-friendly appeal of soul jazz. That was what was selling, and as many of the artists who made that music, like particularly Gene Ammons, were using and didn't have the status of a Davis or a Coltrane, Weinstock was able to pay effectively what he wanted to record them. Now, when you look at the Prestige catalog and you hear me saying, oh, things changed in 1961, it's a little confusing because you do see lots of music from Coltrane and Davis and others appearing through the 1960s. Well, that, of course, as I mentioned, is because Weinstock had a whole bunch of unreleased material on the shelf that he'd kept in the can since the 1950s. So there are plenty of 1960s releases from Davis and particularly from Coltrane, but at that point, that stuff is basically archival releases. The kind of music Prestige was putting out in the 1960s is also affected by what seems at first to be a trivial development, which is the relocation of their office from 446 West 50th in Manhattan to 203 South Washington Drive in Bergenfield, New Jersey. Sometimes it's said that Weinstock made this move to be free of the endless stream of Prestige artists who were showing up at his offices in Midtown looking for cash, for whatever reason they might need. But whatever the reason, by moving over to New Jersey, he was a lot closer to Van Gelder's studio. And when Van Gelder built his new studio in 1959, he'd be even closer still. And this proximity to Van Gelder matters because Weinstock had been in the habit of coming over every Friday with the musicians of that week out to Hackensack, out to Van Gelder's studio. And now that he was in New Jersey himself, this wasn't just an out and back to New Jersey, it would be 2 round trips back into Manhattan, which he didn't really fancy. So the drummer Art Taylor, who's out there for a session, says, Bob, what about my friend Esmond Edwards? He's an X-ray tech and a photographer. He lives in Manhattan. He's got a car. He could bring the musicians out every Friday, and he could hang around and take photographs and be helpful and so on. And this is how Esmond Edwards comes into the frame at Prestige. He turns out to be a keen observer of Weinstock as a producer, and his good fortune was that Weinstock was at that point feeling like his plate was kind of overflowing, and he wanted somebody to be able to hand the reins to. Weinstock hands over those reins on no less a record than this one, Coltrane's debut. Now, it actually says that Weinstock is the producer, that's the supervision credit here, but Weinstock's own interviews and Edwards' own interviews make it clear that Edwards actually was the producer. He also was the photographer. You can see, too, that the photograph and the design credits him here as well. And incidentally, this record kind of puts paid to something you can read on the internet, which says that Prestige moved its offices over to New Jersey in August 1958. I think it has to be much earlier than that. Wikipedia says 1966, which is 100% wrong, but Art Taylor and Bob Weinstock and Esmond Edwards all say in separate interviews multiple times that Edwards was brought into the picture at Prestige only once Weinstock had moved over to New Jersey and was now having this carpooling issue. Weinstock hadn't met Edwards before then, but that record with Coltrane that was produced by Edwards is from May 31st, 1957. That's the recording date. Edwards' photo was on the cover, and given that it would have taken him at least a few months to gain Weinstock's trust to actually be able to produce records without Weinstock paying attention, that puts the move to New Jersey somewhere in the early part of 1957. I mention all this because it's kind of a nerdy obsession amongst record collectors to check out the fine print on labels. And one key piece of evidence as to the age of certain records in the Prestige catalog is the address 446 West 50th, which was the original office location. The first record to actually have the New Jersey address is this one, Soul Train, which comes out in 1958. This isn't an original. This is like an original jazz classics from the 80s. This comes out in October 1958, but I think it's fairly likely that the move happened some 18 months before. Anyway, whatever you think about all that, Edwards ends up doing a lot of work for Prestige. He does a lot of production, he does a lot of photography, he does a lot of design for record covers, and this period of his influence begins a time when Prestige's covers finally have, well, I mean, some of them in the old days were really terrible. They looked like sort of children's cutout exercises, but now they finally have a look and feel that starts to rival or maybe even echo Reed Miles's work at Blue Note around the same time. And again, here's some of his work. This is that great cover of Relaxin', which I think is pretty darn slick for a guy who's an X-ray tech. But the influence of Reed Miles was not accidental, because Reed Miles had actually done some cover work for Prestige. This is actually a design by Reed Miles. There he is, credited in very small print. And Reed Miles had also done at least one other that I can find, Mal Waldron's first record for Prestige, which I think is a fantastic cover. You can see his name just very subtly placed there. So same pressing plant, same recording engineer, same cover designer as Blue Note at some times. Edwards becomes not only a producer but head of A&R at Prestige. And as Prestige enters the 1960s, Weinstock steps even further back from production. People like Ira Gitler, Ozzy Cadena, Cal Lampley, later on Bob Porter, Don Schlitten all come in during the 1960s. And this change of producer, and also the influence that these folks had on A&R, end up with a different kind of a focus for the label. In this period, Prestige's focus clearly deviates from that of its major rivals, Blue Note, Columbia, Impulse, Verve. One of the stories of the 1960s is how jazz becomes detached from its roots, the heart of the black musical tradition in America, and became a more cerebral, experimental, revolutionary, radical kind of form, very detached from the blues, very detached from traditional musical forms entirely. So what had come from the black tradition was now being consumed largely by middle-class white intellectuals. Yeah, I'm looking at me. It was true of Blue Note, it was true of Impulse, it was certainly true of Miles's audience at Columbia, but it wasn't true of Prestige. Prestige remained in touch with black audiences, with soul, with blues, with gospel sounds. They brought in R&B focused tenors like Lockjaw Davis and Willis Jackson, and they brought in organ players, scads of organ players, Shirley Scott, Jack McDuff, Charles Erland, Groove Holmes, on and on and on. Some of this comes from Weinstock having made the mistake of turning down Jimmy Smith, who would go on to make a whole bunch, I think 40 different organ jazz records for Blue Note. So he wasn't going to make that mistake again. In his words, I signed every single organ player I could find after I lost out on Jimmy Smith. I was kind of intrigued by this because I knew there were a lot of organ records in Prestige's catalog, so I crunched the numbers, and it turns out that 1 record in 7 that Prestige releases through its entire run is an organ-led soul jazz record. And almost all of those were recorded after 1958, so in the 1960s, it's actually 1 record in 6. So if Weinstock did make a mistake in not signing Jimmy Smith, he certainly made up for it. Incidentally, that wasn't his only career mistake. He also passed up the chance to sign Bob Dylan in the early 60s. For Prestige, this focus was a good strategy because commercial, bluesy, funky jazz paid the bills. It always had, and it would continue to all the way through the 60s. Weinstock also had his favorites, and the label would go back to the same well time and time again. I counted, and I think there's 887 unique releases on Prestige and its sublabels, jazz sublabels, by 238 separate artists, but there's only 35 artists who account for half of the overall total of what Prestige puts out. And in that 35, the ones doing the real volume were turning out record after record of soul jazz. Here's a graphic which shows you the top dozen leaders in overall output for Prestige with their primary instrument in the next column. And what we can see is that tenors and organ players, usually playing in a commercially friendly style, lead the way. The outliers here, if you want to call them that, are Miles, Coltrane, maybe Red Garland, and Sonny Stitt. Again, this only makes sense because the market for jazz in the early 60s was not what it was in the 1950s. There was lots of other competition. The Beatles were only going to make that worse. So doing things that made sense for the consumer, were attractive to the consumer, only made sense. At this time, Weinstock also creates in the same vein, two sub-imprints, one called Moodsville, one called Swingville, which in terms of production, quality of the musicians, everything else, are at the level of prestige jazz all the way. They also created a label called Bluesville, which was, as you might imagine, a blues label. The point of Moodsville was having well-known players playing kind of chilled-out tracks. Swingville brought the old-time players back, like Benny Carter and Coleman Hawkins, brought them back into the frame. The whole point was to have the LP on the shelf be something predictable, high quality, but predictable for the buyer. At this time, too, Weinstock revives the new jazz imprint, which had been dormant since the early days of the label, and he used it to highlight the more contemporary stuff, which was very different from the soul jazz stuff, the stuff that people like Yusef Lateef and Eric Dolphy in particular were producing. But overall, for Prestige, the 60s marks a shift away from hard bop and towards an embrace of soul jazz. And that, more than anything else, makes 1960s Prestige a distinct animal amongst the major jazz labels. Prestige goes on to make lots of money in the 1960s, which was no mean feat for a jazz label, and put out lots of soul jazz and funky jazz up to the early 1970s. But by 1972, Weinstock had had enough. By the early 1970s, with the dominance of rock and roll and Motown and so on not looking like it was going to wane, Bob Weinstock was finding staying in the black to be an increasing challenge. And so in 1972, he sells the Prestige label and catalog to Fantasy Records, who at that point were flush with cash because they'd made ridiculous amounts of it, having gambled on a little-known act called Creedence Clearwater Revival a few years earlier. After the Fantasy purchase, Prestige doesn't exactly finish as a label, but its output drops basically to a trickle. I think there's something like 50 new records put out as Prestige releases. Some of those are actually pretty good, including some later work by Art Blakey and Hampton Hawes. There's a little bit of work by Dave Fathead Newman, all the way through the 1970s. But for the most part, post-1972, Prestige is effectively a reissue machine for whomever owned the rights. For a while, that was Fantasy Records, which is kind of a bad news, good news story. The original reissues that Fantasy did in the 70s were of very variable quality. Every now and then there's a Van Gelder Provenance record in there, so you have to check the dead wax, but for the most part, they're not particularly good quality. They've got kind of this electric green label, which is pretty obvious when you see it. But then in the 1980s, Fantasy brings about the original Jazz Classics reissue series, which is, well, certainly until the recent sort of all analog festival of releases and reissues, that period in the 1980s was the best single period of properly done reissues of classic 50s and 60s jazz. These days, the rights to Prestige are owned by the Concord Group, and thus we do have this new wave of high quality, all analog reissues, remastered by the likes of Bernie Grundman at Kraft. And there's all kinds of places on the internet to find out about those. I'll leave others to parse the finer details of those post 1980s reissues. When you first think about collecting Prestige, the first thing you notice is that there are a lot of releases, especially if you also include the New Jazz, Moodsville, and Swingville imprints. What also makes it tricky is that Prestige did a lot of repackaging and reissuing old material under new catalog numbers. So while it looks like they put out over 1,000 jazz records, the real total, as I mentioned earlier, is I think 887. Here I'm going to talk about 12-inch LPs and 10-inch LPs, which are the two things that I collect. I'm not going to talk about singles, sorry. And those LPs break down like this, organized by label or sub-label name. Let's start with the very origins of the label at the end of the 40s and early 50s with New Jazz, which of course becomes defunct quite quickly. There's a handful of singles and a handful of early 10-inch LP releases under the New Jazz imprint in the early 1950s. The 10-inch LPs are very rare. I don't have one. They have a yellow label with a deep groove like this. And again, the catalog number starts with NJLP. I've shown you earlier, and I'll show you again. Here is a reissue of NJLP 101, but again, this is put out on Prestige, and as I'll show you shortly, the label looks different from the New Jazz labels. Moving on to Prestige itself, the first place to stop is the 10-inch era, which of course runs for most labels between 1950 and 1955. And for Prestige, the catalog numbers begin with PRLP, and the two series are the 100 series and the 200 series. There's no real difference between the two of them. It's just chronological. Prestige takes over from New Jazz as the label name pretty early on, as I mentioned, I think by about the 6th or 7th release. This is a record by Stan Getz. It's actually originally NJLP 102, but it was reissued, I guess, the same year on Prestige. Here is the original Prestige label. You can see it's got the deep groove like really anything until 1962-63. Prestige there in plain block letters. There is an address which is actually not the 50th Avenue address, but 754 10th Avenue, New York, New York. So that, I guess, is the original address of Prestige. And again, no logo to be seen on the label. There is, of course, a logo, but no picture on the front cover. Now, as I mentioned, from this era, none of these recordings are Van Gelder recordings. The music is great, and by all means, collect them. They're pretty cool, but be warned, the sound quality is not going to be great. That's just a fact. That Stan Getz record in particular, you hear Stan warbling away, but who else is playing with him is kind of a mystery. Anyway, that's the blue label. Here's another example of that. This is the Billy Taylor Trio, made in late 1952. And this record, by this point, if you can see, actually does have the West 50th Street address on it. So they'd moved sometime in 1951 or 52. The first Fireworks labels appear in 1953. They predate by some time Prestige working with Rudy Van Gelder. In their earliest editions, Fireworks labels are either blue or red, sometimes maroon. And I think the very first of those is a record I don't have, PRLP 143 by the Teddy Charles Quartet, New Directions, and that's pressed by Plastilite. That was recorded in December 52 and released a few months later in 1953. Here is a red label version, or maroon label version, the Milt Jackson Quintet, again with the 50th Avenue release, and you can see the fancy fireworks doodles. I don't have any information who actually did that design. It's quite quirky, actually, so very interesting. I don't have any blue label examples, but here's one from later in 1953, the Jimmy Rainey Quintet. The first Van Gelder recording, I think, is made on January 8th, 1954. It's a record made by James Moody called James Moody's Moods. It's actually not released until 1955, but anything made after that pretty much is by Van Gelder. And to be sure, just look in the dead wax for the telltale RVG, which at that point in history would have been hand scratched into the plate. The classic yellow fireworks label, as I mentioned before, comes out at the very end of the 10-inch era in 1955. Once again, this is the Kai and JJ record with the very first ever incidence of the yellow fireworks label, and that's made on December 3rd, 1954. Prestige marks the dawning of the 12-inch era in 1955 by starting the 7000 series. And you should note, too, that as with Blue Note, as with Contemporary, as with other labels who were active in the 10-inch era from 1950 to 1955, Prestige engages in a fair bit of repackaging or compiling earlier 10-inch releases in this longer format. The very first all-new Prestige 12-inch is by the Billy Taylor Trio. It's released 7001, called A Touch of Taylor. It's yellow label, it's deep groove, as would be true going forward for many years. It's got the 446th West 50th address. And as I mentioned, the next significant detail change on the label is the change from the West 50th address to the New Jersey address. That begins, as mentioned again, with Soul Train in October 1958. But of course, as I mentioned, the move probably occurs earlier. When stereo arrives during the sequence, silver replaces yellow for those releases. Stereo in general, between 1958 and 1962, unless you're really confident, like say with contemporary records, is to be viewed with caution. Although I would say Van Gelder's errors tend to be of the hard panning variety more than some of the other, frankly, more egregious mistakes like reprocessing, which happened at this time. So again, be careful with stereo. Deep groove, once again, having nothing to do with the actual sound, but just being the mark that the dies made on the record and pressing, last longer into the 1960s with Prestige than with other labels, although that again has to do with the pressing plants they were using, like Abbey and others, more than it does the label themselves. In 1964, the label redesigns its logo, coming up with the now familiar three-dimensional trident logo there, which you can just see on the left. And as you can see, also adopting a different color scheme. There's no deep groove. You have this deep navy blue, which is typically the color for mono. Sometimes you see black for stereo. Actually, most of the time, I think you see black for stereo. There's also a few gold colored releases for some particular reason between 1964 and 1972. The important thing is not to get too hung up on the livery, because as long as Van Gelder is present as an engineer and the lacquer cutter, then you have a pretty much uninterrupted line of quality from 1954 to 1972. In the 1970s, when Fantasy took over, whether it was a new issue or a reissue, what they did was, well, they kept the trident logo, which you can just basically barely see, I think, in this color scheme, and this kind of electric green color. Unless you can see Van Gelder in the dead wax, I don't think I can see Van Gelder in the dead wax on this copy, which, as I say, is the worst possible copy you could possibly have of this Jackie McLean record, unless you can see the Van Gelder stamp or etching, to be avoided. And then finally, in the 1980s, with the original Jazz Classics era of releases overseen by Fantasy, what you get is a return. Here is Dakar, which is one of those ex post facto releases that Prestige made of a Coltrane record in the 60s, but this is the OJC reissue in the 1980s, or maybe, 1989. The return of the classic yellow livery, but you can tell from a variety of cues, including the lack of deep groove, the weight of the vinyl, the typeface which is used, and of course, the telltale barcode, which starts to appear as the 80s wear on, that it's not the original deal. But do not sleep on original Jazz Classics reissues, because they tend to be of extremely high quality and go still for a pretty decent price. Now, getting back to the New Jazz label, that of course had existed for a very short run back in around 1950. Weinstock brings it back in late 1950s because as he's developing a whole sideline in soul jazz, he wants to be able to distinguish the more cutting-edge contemporary music, like the music being made by people like Eric Dolphy. And one of Prestige's greatest achievements is the great work they did recording Eric Dolphy over the years. So you'll see that the color scheme, however, for New Jazz, this is actually a Japanese pressing. It's not an original American pressing, but it has the same color scheme. The purple with the fancy, very cool looking New Jazz logo, actually. So New Jazz is there for people like Eric Dolphy playing really new jazz, but it's a bit confusing because New Jazz as a revived label wasn't only for cutting edge contemporary stuff, it was also for people like Ray Bryant, who is nothing if not a fairly traditional player. And this is a wonderful solo record, by the way, of his, Alone with the Blues. And here is an actual vintage New Jazz release. You can see the deep groove, and again, that wonderful logo which they came up with. Incidentally, the New Jazz catalog numbers start with either 8200 or 8300. It's a little bit confusing for a couple of reasons. One, the very early ones in the 8200s actually still have a yellow fireworks label. A good example of that is Mal 3 by Mal Waldron. That's probably because the purple labels weren't ready yet. And as the series goes on, also somewhat confusing is that New Jazz becomes more and more dominated by archival releases, and eventually the whole thing winds up in 1965. Anyway, as I think I mentioned, the best stuff on New Jazz is probably the work of Eric Dolphy, which is also, interestingly enough, the closest relationship that Prestige ever had with the avant-garde scene of the 1960s. Between 1960 and 1963, Prestige had another couple of imprints which are relevant to jazz collectors, Moodsville and Swingville. They put out a total of just shy of 50 LPs combined on those two sub-labels. And as I mentioned, they were a bit of an exercise in getting the customer to understand what exactly they were buying in an era which was very fast changing and dynamic for jazz. You might buy something by somebody who was quite a traditional player a few years before, and now they were blowing free. Anyway, Weinstock was communicating very clearly what you were getting inside the tin. Moodsville was basically well-known musicians playing laid-back, atmospheric jazz. For the most part, it's very accessible, very mainstream, but it is also where Yusef Lateef makes an appearance in the Prestige catalog. Swingville, as you may have guessed, is more traditionally oriented. It's a home for former big band stars to stretch out in a small group format playing swing. Here's an example of a Moodsville label. Here's an example of a Swingville label. And as I mentioned, there was another sub-label related to the series called Bluesville, and this is what those labels look like. A final sub-imprint to mention is Status Records, and I mention it just because if you're looking for used records, you're going to encounter it. As far as I can tell, it's basically all reissues of earlier material. Here is a record by Gene Ammons, one of his best actually, nice and cool. Status has a very budget look, so here is what the Status label looks like. Basically one color, somewhat phone it in logo and so on. But there's not much to complain about because it is a Rudy Van Gelder product through and through. The provenance is as for any other Prestige reissue, and so there's no reason not to buy the Status records as down market as they look. Prestige is often mentioned in the same breath as Blue Note, being the two preeminent labels of the great years of modern jazz. It's an extraordinarily prolific label with quality standards that are, generally speaking, in place from the dawn of the Van Gelder era in early 1954 until the sale of the label 18 years later. Like any label, when buying Prestige records, it pays to be selective. The peak points of Prestige are, I would say, the equal of that produced by any label. But there is also a lot of mass-produced soul jazz, which is going to sound, frankly, kind of samey after a while. And that's if you're a fan of jazz organ, which, as regular viewers of this channel will know, I'm not really. No offense meant, organ fans. My suggestions for collecting Prestige and its sublabels are as follows. Number one, as a broad rule, any original era release on a Fireworks label is worth considering because the quality of the recording and the release and all the physical aspects of it is going to be high. Two, once the Trident logo comes in, you're not getting much hard bop unless it's a reissue of something which came out much, much earlier. If you dig soul jazz, however, jump in because you're going to get some of the best that was ever recorded. Three, Prestige recordings and new jazz recordings before the Van Gelder period are very cool and they're very collectible. They're actually quite expensive too, but don't bank on great sound. Too often the engineers hadn't figured out how to record all the instruments or had poor microphones or both. Four, while generally speaking, the quality of Prestige records' original pressings is pretty good, surface noise can happen at points, and it's not always predictable. Weinstock cut corners and used recycled vinyl, or the pressing plants that he was using used recycled vinyl, and he didn't object or he okayed it or whatever. Every now and then you come across a record which just is a little rough sounding in terms of surface noise. As I say, you can't predict it, and it's always worth inquiring, even if it's an original Fireworks release. Five, the later new jazz stuff is pretty cool as a rule, but only as a rule. It's not all cutting edge, and it starts to dissipate into other things very quickly. So again, you have to be selective. Sixth, I recommend you do not sleep on the Moodsville and Swingville sublabels. There are some real gems there. And finally, seventh, for post-sale reissues, avoid the 1970s, but embrace the OJC goodness of the 1980s. And as for the latest wave of all analog releases, you don't need to listen to me. There are plenty of other places on the internet where you're going to get a much more expert opinion. So there we have it. As always, thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful, and please do leave your comments in the space below. And we'll see you next time.